In a world in which people have so many differences, football can often be a rare uniting force. It is by far the most global sport on earth, a fact made possible by the sport's simplicity. As schoolchildren know, all you need to play football is a ball and some goalposts. The ball doesn't necessarily have to be a proper football, almost anything spherical and robust enough will do, and the goalposts can be anything from jumpers to paint on a concrete wall. This has made football extremely popular in affluent nations like France and Germany, but also in some of the poorest countries on earth. So many of the world's great footballers have risen from the favelas of South America or the slums of Africa. Even in the most remote outpost this planet has to offer, the people there will most likely recognise the face of David Beckham or Cristiano Ronaldo. Football exists everywhere from the Falkland Islands to Monaco. Even the world's smallest nation-state, the Vatican City, has a team, which was once managed by the great Giovanni Trapattoni. However, there is one location in which even the world's most global sport has seemingly failed to stretch its tentacles. Last September, I made a video looking at 7 countries that don't have national football teams. Strictly speaking, the title of that video ought to have been 7 countries that don't have FIFA, AFC, CAF, CONCACAF, CONMEBOL, UEFA, or OFC affiliation. Out of the 193 sovereign nation-states recognised by the United Nations, there are 8 which fall into that category, but only 1 which has never had a representative team of any kind. The Marshall Islands is an independent nation made up of 1,156 islands and islets located in the Oceanian subregion of Micronesia. A population of between 58 to 59,000 means the country sits in between Bermuda and Greenland among the list of the most populated nations on Earth, still considerably larger than the likes of the Faroe Islands or San Marino. Yet the Marshall Islands remain virtually untouched by the most popular sport on the planet, where few residents have ever sat through 90 minutes of a match, and even fewer ever kicked a ball themselves. Micronesian colonists discovered the Marshall Islands in the 2nd millennium BC, and the islands were commonly referred to by inhabitants as the gifts from God. The name Marshall Islands didn't come about until a couple of thousand years later, when the British explorer John Marshall visited the islands in 1788. By then, the Marshall Islands had already been a part of the Spanish Empire for more than 200 years, but the major European powers didn't acknowledge Spain's legitimacy over the islands until 1874. In 1885, the German Empire bought part of the islands from Spain, but like many nations in the Pacific, both world wars would be hugely significant in the nation's future. Japan conquered the islands during World War I, bringing them into the Empire of Japan as part of the South Pacific Mandate handed to Japan by the League of Nations. United States troops landed on the Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands in January 1944, and 3 or 4 days of intense and bloody fighting between US and Japanese troops with a significant loss of life ensued. The US troops outnumbered their Japanese counterparts by a margin of roughly 6 to 1, and whilst the US lost around 350 men, almost every one of Japan's 8,000 soldiers on the island were killed. Of the 3,500 men Japan had defending the Roanoke Island, only 51 survived. The United States assumed control of the Marshall Islands from World War II onwards and essentially turned the islands into a faraway nuclear test site. The Pacific Proving Grounds was the official name given to the test sites the United States created on the islands, and 67 nuclear tests would be carried out between 1946 and 1958. Thousands of residents, including the entirety of the Bikini Atoll, were forcibly relocated, many to Ebey Island, making it one of the most overcrowded islands and densely populated places on Earth. Of the 60 islands affected by the United States nuclear tests, only 1 of them was cleaned. The US government still owes the Marshall Islands $2 billion in unpaid compensation that they were ordered to pay by the Nuclear Claims Tribunal, with the consequences of the relocations and contamination with high levels of radiation still remaining in the country in 2020. The Marshall Islands gained official independence in 1979 and became UN members in 1991. Despite that fact, the nation remains essentially a satellite state of the United States. Along with Palau and the Federated States of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands is officially an associate state of the United States. The United States still has significant military presence on the islands in the form of the Ronald Reagan Ballistic Missile Defense Test Site, where ballistic missile tests, as the name suggests, still take place, along with commercial testing run by Elon Musk's company SpaceX. Reports suggest that there are around 2,000 US servicemen and women employed on the island, in addition to 900 locals. Washington recently committed to continuing to send almost $70 million a year of aid to the Marshall Islands, in return for the US's significant military presence on the island. The decades that the Marshall Islands spent under the grip of the United States and its close associations with the superpower that remain have left a very Americanized culture on the islands. In the 1940s and 50s, baseball emerged as the most popular sport in the islands. It has since been replaced by basketball, which is now the most popular sport there, followed by volleyball. Football is not so much as an afterthought in the Marshall Islands, never having really entered the public consciousness. Locals are aware of the sport, but few have ever watched a game. The 2018 World Cup was broadcast in the country, but the time difference meant it was screened in the middle of the night, and only keen football fans who had emigrated to the islands paid any attention. Back in 1991, Australian businessman Mike Slinger attempted to popularise the sport on the islands, and initially encountered some promising signs. He managed to find around 60 keen players, but his ambitions were soon thwarted by the closing of local playing fields. One of the problems with playing football on the Marshall Islands is that there really is nowhere to play. The country is essentially a collection of thousands of atolls, which are just ring-shaped reefs or islands. There is plenty of water surrounding all of the islands that make up the Marshall Islands, but very little land. Although they can be very long, most of the atolls only measure tens of metres in width, making it next to impossible to fit a football pitch. If you look at satellite images of any of the many islands that make up the Marshall Islands, you'll most likely find a road running from one end to the other, sometimes a proper road, sometimes just a dirt track, with buildings on either side, and that occupies the entire island. There are basketball courts and playing fields large enough to play baseball or softball, and even an athletics track. The athletics track is small and not large enough to fit a football pitch inside it. The only known playing field large enough to host a football match is located on Kwajalein Island at the Reagan Test Site, and it's used by the American Army. The only known league ever played on the island also took place at the Reagan Test Site, but the players were said to be made up exclusively of American Army personnel. Ebey Island, which has earned the unenviable nickname the Slum of the Pacific since a number of Marshallese residents relocated to the island, is a particularly fine example of the lack of space in the Marshall Islands. Covering just 0.36 kilometers squared in terms of area, which is roughly 80 acres, the island has a population in excess of 15,000 people, over half of whom are aged under 18. That makes it roughly 4 times as densely populated as the island of Manhattan, despite the fact there is no running water and virtually no employment. Finding room for a football pitch on Ebey Island is simply an impossible and quite frankly ludicrous task. It's not impossible that room could be made for a football pitch elsewhere on the islands, but not without great difficulty. Another thing worth remembering about the geography of the Marshall Islands is how spread out the islands are. An interleague system for most of the islands just wouldn't be possible, due to the enormous distances between islands and the fact few could afford to make the journeys. The Marshall Islands has a total land mass, if one were to combine all 1,156 islands, of around 181 kilometers squared, which is roughly the same size as Liechtenstein. However, in terms of area including oceans, the Marshall Islands cover an incredible 2 million kilometers squared. To put that in perspective, the United Kingdom, with a population in excess of 66 million people, covers just 242,000 kilometers squared, whilst the entire continent of Europe covers 10 million kilometers squared. All that means that there are tremendous hurdles for the Marshall Islands to overcome if they are to ever have any kind of league or national team, and it ignores the fact that there is no real will for it in the country. The Marshallese people never caught the football bug or even really had a chance, so it seems unlikely they will go to great lengths to play the sport anytime soon. More realistic perhaps will be the rise of five-a-side or futsal, with less players and less space required to play games. There are several pre-existing indoor sports centres on the island that could accommodate either five-a-side or futsal, and maybe that's the first step in capturing what is perhaps football's final outpost. Thank you all for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, feel free to give the video a like and subscribe to HITC Sevens. Before I go, it's been a fair old while since I've done an update on the HITC Sevens Fantasy Premier League Not So Many League. We're coming to the business end of the season now, and to make life easy for me giving him a shout out, first place Bebo El Pop's team name is written in Arabic. It's at this point that I shock you all with the revelation that I'm not actually fluent in Arabic, but I'm reliably informed by Google Translate that Bebo's team name just means O when translated into English. That's O as in OH, typically used to express an emotion, not just the letter O. Bebo has racked up an impressive 1,306 points at the time of recording, which is enough to put him at the top of our league and puts him among the top 2,000 players in the world. Josh Nido's Expecting to Lose and Kevin Smith's Test Team Ignore are hot on his heels with 1,302 points each, Meanwhile, the idiot who runs this channel is all the way down in 175th place with just 1,216 points, a tally which puts me just outside the world's top 100,000 players. Apologies for not doing more regular updates on these, I'll try to sort that out, but thank you again for watching today's video and for your continued support of the channel.